Have you ever seen an axolot?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Those weird salamanders with the feathery gills kind of sticking out. I always think they look like they're wearing little red hats or something.
Yeah, they're pretty striking looking creatures.
But it's not just the looks, right? Those gills are they're like a visual reminder of, one of the most fundamental processes in all living things, the gas exchange. And that's actually a perfect segue into what we're diving deep into today.
Absolutely. We're going to be unpacking this chapter all about circulation and gas exchange in animals. Basically, how do animals transport all the essential stuff they need to survive and get rid of the waste?
It's like the ultimate life support system, really, for the entire animal kingdom.
Exactly. And what's so cool is that we see this incredible diversity of strategies and adaptations that have evolved to solve these challenges.
Right, and what always gets me is how perfectly the form fits the function. I mean, the design of a heart or the intricate network of blood vessels, it's like evolution figured out the most efficient way to get the job done.
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
So let's get started. First things first, how do things even move around inside an animal's body in the first place? We're talking about the molecules, the nutrients, the gases. How do they get where they need to go?
Well, the fundamental process is diffusion. It's basically the tendency of molecules to spread out from where they're more concentrated to where they're less concentrated.
Huh?
Just by their random movement,
Right, like if you put a drop of food coloring in a glass of water, it doesn't just stay in one spot. It spreads out until the whole thing is evenly colored.
Exactly.
But the chapter makes it clear that diffusion, while simple enough, has its limitations, especially when you're talking about, distances inside a complex organism.
Yeah, it's all about scale. Diffusion works great over very short distances, like, across a few cell widths. But as the distances get bigger, the time it takes for diffusion to work effectively, it increases exponentially. It's actually proportional to the square of the distance.
So basically what you're saying is that for larger animals, diffusion alone would be way too slow to keep up with the demands of, active tissues and organs.
Right. Think about it. For a molecule of glucose to diffuse just 1 centimeter, it could take like hours, even days.
Wow. So it's clear that multicellular animals needed to evolve some workarounds, some ways to get around this diffusion bottleneck.
Exactly. And there are essentially 2 main strategies that have emerged. The first is, keep things small and simple. If your body is small and flat, or if it have lots of folds and branches, most of your cells are in direct contact with the environment. That minimizes the distances for diffusion.
And the chapter gives us some great examples of this. We see it in the cnidarians, like the hydras and jellyfish.
Yeah.
And also in the flatworms, like planarians.
Yeah, they've got these gastrovascular cavities. Imagine like a hydra or a jellyfish, like Aurelia. They basically have this central sac, often with branches, and it has only one opening to the outside. And that single opening serves as both the mouth and the anus.
So it's not just about digestion.
Right. Food comes in, gets digested in this cavity, and then the nutrients get distributed throughout the body because the fluid inside the cavity bathes all the internal tissues.
It's like an all-in-one digestive and circulatory system.
Exactly. And because these animals have like really thin body walls, sometimes just a couple of cell layers thick, the distances for diffusion are incredibly short.
Okay, so that makes sense for, small, simple animals. But what about the larger, more complex animals, those with higher metabolic demands? How do they get things done?
Well, that's where dedicated circulatory systems come in. These systems are basically like an internal transportation network. They have 3 key components: a circulatory fluid, which is the medium for transport, a network of vessels to carry that fluid throughout the body, and of course a pump, the heart, to keep the fluid moving.
It's like the heart is the engine of this internal transport network.
Precisely.
And the chapter goes into some detail about the 2 main types of circulatory systems, open and closed. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So in an open circulatory system, the circulatory fluid, which is called hemolymph, it's not always confined within vessels. The heart pumps the hemolymph into vessels, but then those vessels empty into open spaces called sinuses, which surround the organs and tissues. So the hemolymph actually bathes the organs directly.
So in a sense, their blood isn't always contained within tubes.
Right. And we see this type of system in arthropods like grasshoppers and some mollusks like clams.
So how does it work exactly?
Well, the heart contracts and pumps the hemolymph out into the sinuses. And it's within these sinuses that the exchange of gases, nutrients, and wastes happens directly between the hemolymph and the body cells. And then when the heart relaxes, the hemolymph is drawn back into the heart through pores, which often have valves to prevent backflow.
Okay, so that's open. What about closed circulatory systems?
In a closed circulatory system, the circulatory fluid, which we call blood, is always contained within vessels. It doesn't mix with the interstitial fluid that surrounds the cells. The heart pumps the blood through a continuous network of vessels, starting with large arteries that branch into smaller and smaller vessels, eventually reaching the capillary.
And we see this type of system in annelids like earthworms, in cephalopods like squids and octopuses, and of course in all vertebrates.
Exactly. And the fact that both open and closed systems exist tells us that each one offers certain evolutionary advantages depending on the animal's lifestyle and environment.
Right, so what are the pros and cons of each?
Open systems, well, they generally operate at lower pressures, so they require less energy to run. And in some cases, the hydrostatic pressure of the hemolymph can even be used for other functions, like in spiders, they use it to extend their legs.
Wow, so it's not just about transport.
Right. Now, closed systems, they allow for much higher blood pressure, which is essential for efficient circulation, especially in larger, more active animals. And they also allow for a much finer degree of control over where the blood is directed. You can regulate blood flow to specific organs based on their needs.
So it's like having a more sophisticated, targeted delivery system.
Exactly.
Now, when we talk about vertebrates, the chapter introduces this term, the cardiovascular system. What exactly does that encompass?
It basically refers to the heart and the entire network of blood vessels, and it's a remarkably extensive network.
It is.
If you were to lay out all the blood vessels in an average human end to end, you know how long they would be?
I have no idea.
About 100,000 kilometers.
That's insane.
It is. That's enough to circle the Earth like 2.5 times.
Wow. And within this vast network, we have three main types of blood vessels, right? The arteries, the veins, and the capillaries.
Right. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back towards the heart, and capillaries are the tiny vessels where the actual exchange of gases, nutrients, and wastes happens between the blood and the body's cells.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit further. What are the key features of each type of vessel?
So, starting with arteries, they have thick, muscular walls that can withstand the high pressure of blood being pumped out of the heart. And they also have elastic fibers in their walls, which allows them to expand and recoil with each heartbeat, helping to maintain a continuous flow of blood.
And that's what we feel as our pulse, right?
Exactly.
Okay, what about veins?
Veins carry blood back to the heart at a much lower pressure, so their walls are thinner than those of arteries. And they also have these one-way valves inside them which prevent blood from flowing backwards.
It's like a series of check valves, ensuring that the blood keeps moving in the right direction.
Precisely.
Now, the capillaries, those are where the real action happens, right?
Absolutely. Capillaries are incredibly tiny and thin-walled. Their walls are just one cell layer thick, which allows for the efficient diffusion of gases, nutrients, and wastes between the blood and the surrounding tissues.
It's like the capillaries are the ultimate delivery service, bringing the goods right to the doorstep of each cell.
That's a good analogy.
Okay, so we've talked about the vessels. Now let's talk about the pump, the heart. The chapter points out that all vertebrate hearts have at least two chambers, the atria and the ventricles.
Right. The atria are the receiving chambers. They collect blood returning to the heart, either from the body or from the lungs. And then the ventricles are the pumping chambers. They have thicker, more muscular walls because they're the ones that actually propel the blood out of the heart and into the circulatory system.
And the number and arrangement of these chambers, they vary across different vertebrate groups, right?
Yeah. The simplest hearts, with just two chambers, one atrium and one ventricle, are found in fish. They have what's called single circulation, where the blood flows through the body in a single continuous loop. It goes from the heart to the gills for gas exchange, then to the body's tissues, and then back to the heart.
So the blood only passes through the heart once in each complete circuit.
Exactly.
Now, all other vertebrates, from amphibians to birds and mammals, they have double circulation. What's the key difference there?
In double circulation, the heart is essentially divided into two separate pumps. The right side of the heart pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs or skin for gas exchange, and the left side of the heart receives that oxygenated blood and pumps it out to the rest of the body.
So it's like having two separate circuits working in parallel.
Right. And this double circulation is much more efficient because it allows for higher blood pressure in the systemic circuit, the one that supplies the body. That means oxygen and nutrients can be delivered much faster to the tissues.
And the chapter goes into some detail about the evolutionary variations within double circulation, particularly among amphibians and reptiles. They often have three-chambered hearts, with an incomplete separation of the ventricles. Why is that?
It gives them more flexibility, especially those that live in both water and on land. They can shunt blood flow between the pulmonary circuit, which goes to the lungs, and the systemic circuit, which goes to the body.
It's like it's like they can adjust their circulation depending on whether they're breathing air or using their skin for gas exchange.
Exactly. Now, birds and mammals, we have four-chambered hearts with complete separation between the two ventricles. This means there's no mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, which is super important for maintaining our high metabolic rates and body temperatures.
Right, because we're endotherms, we generate our own body heat.
Exactly. And it's interesting to note that this four-chambered heart actually evolved independently in the ancestors of birds and mammals. It's a great example of convergent evolution, where two groups of animals evolved similar solutions to the same problem.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's zoom in on the mammalian heart. Can you walk us through the path of blood flow in a typical mammal like ourselves?
Sure. So deoxygenated blood from the body returns to the heart through two large veins, the superior vena cava, which brings blood from the upper body, and the inferior vena cava, which brings blood from the lower body. This blood enters the right atrium, and from there it flows through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle.
And what?
The right ventricle contracts and pumps the blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries, which carry the blood to the lungs.
And this is the only time that arteries carry deoxygenated blood, right?
Right. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide in the tiny capillaries that surround the alveoli, those little air sacs in the lungs.
And then the now oxygenated blood returns to the heart.
Exactly. It comes back through the pulmonary veins, the only veins that carry oxygenated blood, and enters the left atrium. From the left atrium, it flows through the mitral valve into the left ventricle.
And the left ventricle is the really powerful one, right?
Right. It has to pump the blood throughout the entire body. So when the left ventricle contracts, it forces the blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body.
And the aorta then branches out to supply all the different parts of the body.
Precisely. And then, after delivering oxygen and nutrients and picking up carbon dioxide and other waste products, the blood returns to the heart through the veins, completing the circuit.
So it's like a continuous loop, constantly delivering oxygen and removing waste.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay, so we've traced the path of blood flow. Now, what about the heart itself? How does it actually work? What keeps the blood flowing in the right direction?
Well, the heart has these four valves that act like one-way doors, ensuring that blood flows in the correct direction. Two of them are called the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. One is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, called the tricuspid valve, and the other is between the left atrium and the left ventricle, called the mitral or bicuspid valve.
And what about the other two valves?
The other two are called the semilunar valves. One is the pulmonary valve, which is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, and the other is the aortic valve, which is between the left ventricle and the aorta.
So these valves open and close in a very precise sequence to keep the blood flowing in the right direction.
Exactly. And when those valves close, it's what creates the lubbed-up sounds that you hear when you listen to a heartbeat.
That's fascinating. Now, what about the heart rate? How is that regulated?
Well, the heart has its own internal pacemaker, a group of specialized cells called the sinoatrial node, or SA node, which is located in the wall of the right atrium. This SA node generates electrical impulses that spread through the heart muscle, causing it to contract.
So the heart can beat on its own, without any external input from the nervous system.
Right. But the nervous system can influence the heart rate, speeding it up or slowing it down depending on the body's needs. And hormones, like adrenaline, can also affect the heart rate.
Okay, so the heart is a pretty amazing organ. It's got its own built-in electrical system, its own set of valves, and it's constantly working to keep the blood flowing.
It is.
Now, let's go back to the blood vessels for a minute. We talked about their basic structure, but the chapter also goes into more detail about how their structure relates to their function.
Yeah. So capillaries, remember, they're where the exchange of gases and nutrients happens. Their walls are incredibly thin, just one cell layer thick, which allows for rapid diffusion.
Right, because diffusion works best over very short distances.
Exactly. Now, arteries, they have thicker, more muscular walls because they have to withstand higher pressure. And they also have elastic fibers, which allows them to expand and recoil, helping to maintain a continuous blood flow.
And veins, they have thinner walls than arteries, and they also have valves to prevent backflow.
Right. Now, another important point is that the diameter of blood vessels can change, especially the arterioles, those small arteries that lead to the capillaries. They can constrict or dilate, which changes the resistance to blood flow and affects blood pressure.
So how is that regulated?
The smooth muscle in the walls of the arterioles is controlled by the nervous system and by hormones. For example, if your body needs to increase blood flow to a particular area, the arterioles in that area will dilate.
And the opposite happens if blood flow needs to be reduced.
Exactly. And this regulation is really important for maintaining blood pressure and ensuring that blood is directed where it's needed most.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about blood pressure itself. How is it generated and how is it measured?
Blood pressure is generated by the force of the heart contracting and pushing blood out into the arteries. And it's measured in millimeters of mercury, or millimA-Hg.
And we usually see two numbers, like 120 over 80. What do those numbers mean?
The top number, the systolic pressure, is the pressure in the arteries when the heart is contracting. And the bottom number, the diastolic pressure, is the pressure when the heart is relaxing between beats.
Okay, so those numbers tell us the range of pressure in our arteries.
Right. And it's important to note that blood pressure can be affected by a lot of things, like stress, exercise, and even gravity.
Right, because gravity pulls blood downwards. So the pressure in our legs is higher than the pressure in our head when we're standing up.
Exactly. And that's why sometimes people feel dizzy or even faint if they stand up too quickly because the blood pressure in their head drops too low.
Okay, so how does the body make sure the blood keeps flowing back to the heart, especially from the legs, where it has to work against gravity?
Well, the veins have those one-way valves, which we talked about earlier, and the contraction of skeletal muscles, especially in the legs, helps to squeeze the veins and push blood towards the heart.
It's like our leg muscles act as auxiliary pumps.
That's a good way to think about it.
Now, we've talked about how blood flows through the arteries and veins, but what about at the capillary level? How do substances actually move between the blood and the tissues?
Well, there are a few different mechanisms. Small molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they move by diffusion from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration.
Right, so oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissues, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the tissues into the blood.
Exactly. Now, larger molecules like proteins and hormones, they sometimes move by vesicle transport. That's where they're enclosed in tiny membrane-bound sacs that move across the cell membrane.
Okay, so that's diffusion and vesicle transport. What about this bulk flow of fluid that the chapter mentions?
Bulk flow is driven by differences in pressure between the blood and the interstitial fluid. At the arterial end of a capillary, the blood pressure is higher than the pressure in the surrounding tissues, so fluid is pushed out of the capillary and into the interstitial fluid.
And at the venous end, the opposite happens.
Well, not quite. At the venous end, the blood pressure is lower, but there's also this thing called osmotic pressure, which is generated by the higher concentration of proteins in the blood compared to the interstitial fluid. This osmotic pressure pulls fluid back into the capillary.
So it's like a tug of war between blood pressure pushing fluid out and osmotic pressure pulling fluid in.
Exactly.
Now, not all of the fluid that's pushed out of the capillaries at the arterial end gets pulled back in at the venous end. What happens to that excess fluid?
That's where the lymphatic system comes in.
Ah, yes, the lymphatic system. That's often kind of overlooked, isn't it?
It is, but it's really important. It's basically a network of vessels that collects that excess fluid, which is now called lymph, and returns it to the bloodstream.
So it's like a drainage system for the tissues.
Exactly. And the lymphatic system is also really important for the immune system. It contains lymph nodes, which are like little filters that trap bacteria and other foreign invaders.
So the lymphatic system is a multitasking marvel. It helps to maintain fluid balance in the body, and it also plays a key role in immunity.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about blood itself. What's in it, and what are the different components responsible for?
Well, blood is made up of both plasma, which is the liquid part, and cellular elements, which are the cells and cell fragments. Plasma is mostly water, but it also contains a lot of dissolved substances like ions, proteins, nutrients, and wastes.
And what about the cellular elements?
There are three main types: red blood cells, or erythrocytes, white blood cells, or leukocytes, and platelets.
Okay, so let's start with red blood cells. What's their main job?
Red blood cells are responsible for transporting oxygen throughout the body. They contain a protein called hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen in the lungs and releases it in the tissues.
And what gives them their distinctive red color?
It's the iron in the hemoglobin that gives them their red color.
Okay, what about white blood cells? What do they do?
White blood cells are part of the immune system. They fight off infections and other invaders. There are different types of white blood cells, each with its own specific role in the immune response.
And platelets, what are they responsible for?
Platelets are small cell fragments that are involved in blood clotting. If you get a cut, platelets stick to the damaged area and help to form a clot, which stops the bleeding.
So blood clotting is basically a cascade of events that ultimately leads to the formation of a solid plug to seal a wound.
Right. And it's a really important process. Without it, we would bleed to death from even minor injuries.
Now, where do all these blood cells come from?
They're all produced in the bone marrow, a spongy tissue found inside our bones.
Fascinating. So the bone marrow is like the blood cell factory of the body.
It is.
Now, the chapter also talks about cardiovascular diseases.
Right.
What are some of the major culprits there?
Well, one of the most common is atherosclerosis, which is a buildup of plaque, fats, and cholesterol inside the arteries. This plaque can harden and narrow the arteries, making it harder for blood to flow through.
And that can lead to serious problems, right?
It can. If a piece of plaque breaks off, it can form a blood clot, which can block an artery completely. If that happens in an artery that supplies the heart, it can cause a heart attack. And if it happens in an artery in the brain, it can cause a stroke.
So high cholesterol and high blood pressure are major risk factors for cardiovascular disease.
They are. And so are smoking, lack of exercise, and a diet high in saturated and trans fats.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about circulation, blood, the heart, blood vessels, and even some cardiovascular diseases.
We have.
Now, the next big topic in the chapter is gas exchange.
Right. And that's all about how animals get the oxygen they need and get rid of the carbon dioxide they produce.
And this is where those axolots with their external gills come back into the picture.
Exactly. Their gills are a great example of a specialized respiratory surface.
So what makes a good respiratory surface?
Well, it needs to be thin and moist so that gases can diffuse across it easily. And it needs to have a large surface area to maximize the amount of gas exchange that can take place.
So it's all about maximizing efficiency, just like with the circulatory system.
Exactly.
Now, the chapter describes several different types of respiratory surfaces that have evolved in the animal kingdom. Can you walk us through some of them?
Sure. The simplest type is just the skin itself. Some animals, like earthworms, can exchange gases directly through their skin as long as it stays moist.
Right, because gases can't diffuse across a dry surface.
Exactly. Now, aquatic animals often have gills, which are specialized outfordings of the body surface that are richly supplied with blood vessels.
And gills come in all shapes and sizes, right?
They do. Some are external, like those of the axolotl, while others are internal, like those of fish.
And fish gills are particularly efficient, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They have a countercurrent exchange system where the blood flows in the opposite direction to the water that's flowing over the gills. This maximizes the amount of oxygen that can be extracted from the water.
That's really clever. So that's gills for aquatic animals. What about terrestrial animals?
Well, insects have a unique respiratory system called a tracheal system. It's a network of branching tubes called tracheae that carry air directly to the tissues.
So their circulatory system isn't involved in gas exchange at all.
Not directly, no.
Wow, that's pretty different from our system.
It is. Now, most terrestrial vertebrates, including amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, we all have lungs.
And lungs are basically internal sacs that are specialized for gas exchange, right?
Right. They're highly folded to increase their surface area, and they're richly supplied with blood vessels.
Now, amphibian lungs are relatively simple, aren't they?
They are. They're basically just simple sacs. And many amphibians rely on their skin for a significant amount of gas exchange, especially when they're in water.
Right, so they can breathe through both their lungs and their skin.
Exactly. Now, reptile lungs are more complex than amphibian lungs. They have more folds, which increases their surface area.
And bird lungs are even more efficient, right?
They are. Bird lungs are really unique. They have these air sacs that extend throughout the body, and they have a one-way flow of air through the lungs, which maximizes gas exchange.
So birds have a super efficient respiratory system to support their high metabolic demands for flight.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about mammalian lungs in more detail.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the path of air as it travels through our respiratory system?
Sure. So air enters through the nostrils and passes through the nasal cavity where it's warmed, humidified, and filtered.
And the nasal cavity also plays a role in our sense of smell.
It does. From the nasal cavity, the air passes into the pharynx, which is a common passageway for both air and food. Then it goes through the larynx, which contains the vocal cords.
And that's where we make sounds.
Right. From the larynx, the air travels down the trachea, which is a rigid tube that's reinforced with rings of cartilage.
And the trachea branches into two bronchi, one for each lung.
Right. And then the bronchi branch into smaller and smaller tubes called bronchioles, which eventually lead to the alveoli.
And the alveoli are the tiny air sacs where the actual gas exchange happens.
Exactly. They're surrounded by capillaries, and it's across the thin walls of the alveoli and the capillaries that oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out.
Okay, so that's how air gets into our lungs and down to the alveoli. But how do we actually breathe? How do we get air in and out?
Mammals, we breathe by negative pressure breathing. We have a large sheet of muscle called the diaphragm that separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity.
And when the diaphragm contracts, it flattens out, which increases the volume of the chest cavity.
Right. And that decrease in pressure in the chest cavity pulls air into the lungs.
And then when the diaphragm relaxes, it domes back up, decreasing the volume of the chest cavity and pushing air out of the lungs.
Exactly. And we can also use muscles in our chest wall to help with both inhalation and exhalation.
So breathing is a coordinated effort between the diaphragm and the chest muscles.
It is.
Now, the chapter also mentions respiratory pigments. What are those and why are they important?
Respiratory pigments are proteins that bind to oxygen and transport it throughout the body. They're important because oxygen doesn't dissolve very well in water, which is the main component of blood.
So without respiratory pigments, our blood wouldn't be able to carry enough oxygen to meet our needs.
Exactly. The most common respiratory pigment is hemoglobin, which is found in red blood cells.
And hemoglobin is what gives blood its red color.
Right. Hemoglobin contains iron, which binds to oxygen.
So that's how oxygen gets transported throughout the body. How about carbon dioxide?
Most carbon dioxide is transported in the blood as bicarbonate ions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about circulation, gas exchange, blood, the heart, blood vessels, respiratory pigments, and even some cardiovascular diseases. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that circulation and gas exchange are absolutely essential for life. These systems work together to ensure that every cell in the body gets the oxygen and nutrients it needs and gets rid of the waste products it produces.
And they're incredibly efficient and well-designed systems.
They are, and they've evolved over millions of years to meet the specific needs of different animals and different environments.
Absolutely. So next time you take a breath or feel your heartbeat, take a moment to appreciate the amazing complexity and efficiency of these systems.
I agree. And think about all the different adaptations that have evolved to make these systems work so well in such a wide variety of animals.
It really is a testament to the power of evolution.
It is.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.